Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and I find this incidental anecdote immensely interesting. So, I think Jurassic Park is one of the best movies ever made. The camera work Spielberg implements to capture scenes, set moods, and emphasize the visual symbolism all work in tandem for a multifaceted, multi-genre film that took the world by storm back in the 90s. We often, and rightfully, attribute at least some of the early intrigue in MMPR to this cinematic classic due to the massive surge in Dino popularity JP created in the same year PR started. A surge still felt today, as the kids who grew up with it are now making strides in paleontology. PR isn't blind to that either, as they take the time to reference JP during their first movie. And it gets even more interesting when you take into account how much Godzilla, one of the linchpins of tokusatsu, inspired Spielberg's vision for dinosaurs. So taken all together, these two very distinct franchises aren't but a few branches apart. The reason I wanted to start with all of that in a video about Dino Thunder is because the most fascinatingly incidental aspect of its story is how much it touches on some of the same themes present in the original Jurassic Park. Dino Thunder, a season built to evoke the spirit of the original seasons, also just so happens to position unchecked scientific meddling as a means towards largely financial ends as a disaster waiting to happen. As such, this reinterpretation of the most famous Ranger motif ended up becoming this somewhat more nuanced take on dinosaurs and dino-like machinations as not just machines that are here because Zordon old, but biological machine hybrids we have to consider in a more moral context. Based purely on the information I could dig up, there is no indication that showrunners Doug Sloan and Ann Austin were intentional about mimicking some of JP's dino-led philosophies, even though they very well could have been. The only production notes they seemed to get, though, was to make a slightly more serious season than Ninja Storm. But it's endlessly fascinating to me regardless, because the takeaway here seems to be that, intentional or otherwise, even when writing a show far less ambitious than JP was, the natural inclination is to question the motives and moral leanings of rich men obsessed with forcing life back into creatures that naturally died off. Men that seem to have scientific aspiration as motivating forces, but actually money. And what's specifically focused on is how the direct effects of this unnatural science lends itself to conflict. And that's why I find Mesogog, and maybe Anton Mercer even more so, to be such wonderful characters. On the surface, they're this unique mishmash of many of the elements that define Mr. Collins, combined with some of the elements that would go on to define Jared. But there's also a lot of attention paid to how Anton's relationships have, and continue to, change and erode around him. Anton becoming Mesogog as a result of feeling pressured to carry his research forward was just the initial step. It was the combination of that, and his waning friendship with Smitty, who also succumbed to a science experiment gone wrong after the fact, that created Zeltrax as we know him. And it was the combination of Anton's very businesslike approach to adoptive fatherhood and Mesogog's villainous influence that turned Trent into an unwitting vessel for the White Ranger powers. We're never given Elsa's full story, but one would imagine it follows a similar pattern. What makes Mesogog scary isn't just the impossibly great voice performance or the amazing suit work, both perfectly capturing his unsettling hybrid nature as a monster of science. More than even those two valuable assets is how Mesogog visually represents the figurative and literal destruction of everything and everyone involved with Anton by way of a force he couldn't hope to control. The creation of Mesogog was his worst mistake, but we also see clearly throughout this story that his inability to face up to it with any immediacy only creates more problems for himself, his lackeys, Trent, and of course the other Rangers. Problems that aren't solved until it becomes evident how close he is to Mesogog in more ways than physically. Worth noting is that the antagonists are all fighting because his mistake stripped them of their free will. What Mesogog did and continued to do to Elsa, to Zeltrax, and to Anton himself isn't terribly dissimilar from what Anton's been trying to do with Trent's life, and only after realizing that can he start to become the father Trent needs. Not the kind that tries to buy employment for him or insist that the employment he does have isn't Mercer enough, but the kind that understands that the relationship Mesogog and his subordinates have is eerily similar to the relationship he forced upon his son, to the point where, while under the influence of evil, Trent reminds his father in no uncertain terms that this is what he wanted. on a literal level, we understand this to mean that the growing White Ranger powers supports Mesogog's goals. But because Trent doesn't see much of a material difference between the man and the monster, we can also read this scene as Trent fulfilling what he believes to be his father's ambition specifically. In this moment, we see Trent finally being the subservient son Anton had been actively pushing for, a son also consumed by powers he created. So, fittingly, it's that same moment that forces him to recognize that aforementioned eerie truth. Realizing, rejecting, and later resolving all of that allows for his son to take full control of his powers after fighting against Mesogog's control, and eventually, it allows Anton to absolve himself of Mesogog completely. And with both Mercer men having full agency in the end, Anton can finally stop arbitrarily hating Trent's art and forcing him into his rigid view of success. It's certainly an optimistic take on out-of-touch billionaires and their ability to recognize the responsibility they shoulder for the harm their influence causes, but a fine one nonetheless, and one of many Power Ranger tales that forces its characters to recognize their own deeply seated faults and fight against them, in more ways than one. It's also why I find the final fight of the season so perfectly fitting. The Rangers aren't facing off against the intelligent, level-headed, manipulative version of Mesogog, but a wild and even more monstrous version. It fully embodies the unpredictable and uncontrollable experiment Anton Mercer forced upon himself, one that seemed to only be stabilized by the influence of Anton's humanity. So without one to influence the other, and vice versa, Anton has an avenue to not be a monster anymore, just like Jared, and Mesogog drops the pretense and engages the Rangers in his final, and I'd argue truer, form, just like Daishi. The only aspect of this tale that always causes my brain to itch is the story's unwillingness to have Tommy shoulder much, if any, responsibility for the way things turn out. I've said it maybe 5 times over the last 5 years, but it just doesn't sit well in a story that does want to be a bit more nuanced, and that does want to speak on the consequences and moral quandaries of unnatural and over-accelerated progress, but seems afraid of painting the franchise Golden Boy in a potentially bad light. This, despite the script making it very clear that not only did he help create the Tyranno drones, but he also likely did a lot of the research that directly led to Mesogog. And then, the one time the story does attempt that position, it's through Zeltrax's reveal after a half-season long revenge tour. But that's one of the few times where it absolutely wasn't Tommy's fault. Anton and Mesogog are to blame there, and to some degree whatever lab Smitty ended up working for next. It's hard to say why the alignment between narrative and character seems to fray here specifically, but since JDF himself is very particular about how the role of Tommy plays out, I wouldn't be all that surprised if this was just an early example of that. After all, he got to fly back to Cali anytime he wanted during filming, so it would track if he had at least some say in making sure Tommy's post-Turbo history couldn't be questioned too harshly, even though by mostly avoiding it, we're simply left with more questions than if they had just completely avoided it. All in all, I think Mesogog and Anton Mercer are really good characters, and both ended up creating one of the better PR villains to date. And even with the inconsistency of how Tommy fits into the bigger picture here, it still works a lot cleaner than expected as a cautionary tale about how compromising yourself for your goals ends up negatively impacting both yourself and those around you. And it's all the more impressive when you realize that Latham Gaines worked double duty here, both acting as Anton and voicing for Mesogog, which I'm only now realizing is something Sloan and Austin love to do in their seasons. But even in that small showrunner flair, you can see just how talented the pair were when it came time to switch up tones for their Disney overlords, because the joke in Ninja Storm is how little it matters that Lothar and Sensei are brothers, literally played by the same actor. Conversely, one of the most crucial aspects of Dino Thunder is how harrowing it is that Anton and Mesogog are also literally the same person, and how having this self-made demon lurking inside of him is only aiding his morally dubious mentality. Not everyone could make that tonal shift work so well, but they did. And that's just one of the many details that made their far too short-lived era of PR production among my favorite points in this franchise. So, with all that said, thank you all for supporting another one of my PR character breakdowns. I forgot to mention it last time, but we've now passed the 60k sub mark, and I could not have done it without all of your engagement and willingness to watch my stuff and general awesomeness. I plan to continue branching out my content while still doing plenty of PR stuff, as my previous rock video would attest to. By the way, go watch it if you haven't, it's pretty good. So I hope all 60k of you will continue to follow me through these ventures and help me reach the next milestone. But until then, thanks for watching.